This
Picture
isn't a
this.
joke.
You're
We have a
sitting in your
serious
comfortable
problem.
office
All right,
chair.
sorry, what
Coffee
is it?
growing
The
cold as you
discrepancies in
scroll
these
through yet
reports.
another
I
mundane
see.
Tuesday morning.
So, the Inspector General's office
Suddenly,
is coming?
your colleague
Yes,
starts
and we're all
making
set.
jokes about
Great.
the new
This
woman
will
who
be
barely
smooth.
speaks
Couldn't
during
agree more.
meetings. Everyone's laughing. It feels harmless, right? Just office banter about someone who seems a little too quiet, a little too reserved. But what if I told you that in less than 4 hours, that same quiet woman would be sitting across from that colleague in a boardroom, holding his entire career in her hands? What if those harmless jokes were actually being made about someone who had the power to shut down entire departments, fire executives, and expose corruption that could make headlines? This isn't fiction. This isn't some feel-good movie plot. This is the true story of Marcus Chen, a mid-level marketing manager who thought he knew exactly who belonged in his world and who didn't. A man who learned that sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones who choose to stay silent until they don't. Before you judge Marcus too harshly, ask yourself, how many times have you made assumptions about someone based on their quiet demeanor? How many times have you mistaken silence for weakness or reserve for incompetence? What you're about to read will change how you see that quiet person in your office, your classroom, or your neighborhood forever. Because sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is exactly the person you should have been respecting all along. This is a story about power, perception, and the dangerous game of assumptions we all play every single day. Marcus Chen adjusted his silk tie and glanced at his Rolex as he stepped into the elevator at Meridian Financial Group's downtown headquarters. Tuesday morning, 8:47 a.m., and he was already running through his mental checklist for the day. The quarterly marketing review at 10, lunch with the Henderson account team, and hopefully enough time to finalize the presentation that could secure his promotion to Senior Marketing Director. At 34, Marcus had worked hard to build his reputation at Meridian. He drove a BMW, lived in a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows, and wore suits that cost more than some people made in a week. He wasn't born into wealth, but he'd climbed his way up from a small accounting firm in Queens to one of the most prestigious financial consulting companies on the East Coast. Every handshake was calculated, every conversation was an opportunity, and every person he met was either useful to his career or irrelevant to it. The elevator stopped at the 15th floor, and Marcus stepped out into the familiar buzz of his department. The marketing wing of Meridian was his domain. Sleek glass offices, modern furniture, and the constant hum of ambition that Marcus thrived on. He loved the energy here, the way deals were made over expensive coffee, the way million-dollar campaigns were born from casual conversations in hallways that cost more to design than most people's houses. "Morning, Marcus," called out Jennifer Walsh from her corner office. Jennifer was the department's star performer, a woman in her early 40s who could sell ice to penguins and had the commission checks to prove it. "Ready for the Henderson presentation?" "More than ready," Marcus replied with his trademark confident smile. "I've got some ideas that are going to blow their minds." As he settled into his office, Marcus noticed something unusual. There was a woman sitting in the small conference room adjacent to his floor, someone he'd never seen before. She appeared to be in her late 30s or early 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a plain navy blazer and was quietly reviewing what looked like a stack of documents. Everything about her seemed unremarkable. No designer clothes, no flashy jewelry, no power accessories that usually signaled importance in their world. "Who's the new temp?" Marcus asked his assistant Kelly as she brought him his morning espresso. Kelly glanced toward the conference room and shrugged. "I'm not sure. She's been there since I got in at 8. Didn't say much when I offered her coffee. Just a quiet no thank you and went back to her paperwork. Maybe she's from HR? Or one of those compliance people?" Marcus barely gave it another thought. Meridian was always bringing in temporary workers, consultants, and various support staff. The company was massive. Over 3,000 employees across 12 floors, and Marcus had learned to focus only on the people who mattered to his career trajectory. Someone sitting quietly in a conference room with a stack of papers clearly wasn't one of them. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. Marcus reviewed campaign analytics, participated in a conference call with clients in California, and spent an hour perfecting his presentation slides. Around 9:30, he decided to grab another coffee from the break room, which happened to be right next to the conference room where the quiet woman was still working. As he passed by, he could see her more clearly through the glass walls. She was methodically going through what appeared to be financial documents, making notes in neat handwriting, occasionally typing something on a laptop that looked like it had seen better days. Her concentration was intense, but there was something almost invisible about her presence, the way she seemed to blend into the furniture, requiring no attention or acknowledgement from anyone around her. "Still here, I see," Marcus commented to Tom Rodriguez, one of his marketing colleagues who had joined him at the coffee machine. "Who?" Tom asked, following Marcus's gaze. "The mystery woman in conference room B. Kelly thinks she might be from compliance or something." Tom chuckled. "Oh, her. Yeah, I saw her earlier. Looks like she's having a thrilling morning with spreadsheets and filing cabinets. Probably some internal audit thing. You know how these corporate types love their paperwork." Marcus stirred his coffee and watched as the woman reached for another folder from a large box beside her chair. "I don't get it," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Look at her. She's been sitting in the same spot for over an hour, going through papers like she's searching for buried treasure. Doesn't she have anything better to do? I mean, we're running a multi-million-dollar marketing operation here, and she's... what, organizing filing systems?"
Tom laughed. Maybe she's one of those people who gets excited about tax codes and regulation updates.
Takes all kinds, right? Although I have to say, she doesn't exactly scream dynamic corporate professional. As if sensing their conversation, the woman looked up briefly in their direction. Her expression was neutral, neither friendly nor unfriendly, simply observant. She held their gaze for perhaps 2 seconds before returning to her documents. There was something about her eyes that Marcus couldn't quite place, a sharpness that seemed at odds with her unremarkable appearance. "Did you see that?" Marcus asked. "The way she looked at us? Like she was taking mental notes or something." "You're being paranoid," Tom replied. "She probably just heard us talking. Come on, we've got the Henderson meeting in 20 minutes. But as they walked back toward their offices, Marcus found himself glancing over his shoulder. The woman was still there, still working methodically through her papers, but now he noticed something else. She had a small digital recording device on the table next to her laptop, and occasionally she would speak quietly into it, too softly for anyone outside the room to hear. "That's odd," Marcus thought to himself. "What kind of compliance work requires recording notes?" The question nagged at him as he prepared for his morning meetings, but he pushed it aside. He had bigger things to worry about than some anonymous woman doing paperwork in a conference room. The Henderson account was worth $12 million, and if he could nail this presentation, it would virtually guarantee his promotion. At 9:45, Marcus gathered his materials and headed toward the main conference room for the Henderson meeting. As he walked past conference room B, he noticed the woman was now on what appeared to be a phone call. She was speaking quietly, but he caught a few words as he passed. "Significant irregularities in the quarterly reports. And will need to schedule interviews with..." Marcus slowed his pace slightly, trying to catch more of the conversation, but the woman noticed him loitering outside and turned away, lowering her voice even further. Frustrated and now running late, Marcus continued to his meeting. The Henderson presentation went well. Better than well, actually. Marcus felt confident that he'd impressed both his own team and the clients with his innovative approach to their rebranding campaign. As the meeting wrapped up around 11:30, he was riding high on the success, already imagining the congratulatory email from his boss and the salary increase that would surely follow. "Excellent work, Marcus," said David Henderson himself as they shook hands. "Your team clearly understands our vision. We'll have an answer for you by Friday." Walking back to his office, Marcus felt invincible. This was what he lived for. The thrill of closing deals, the satisfaction of outperforming his colleagues, the rush of knowing he was exactly where he belonged in the corporate hierarchy. Some people were meant for greatness, and others were meant to sit in conference rooms organizing paperwork. Marcus knew which category he belonged in. But as he passed conference room B, he noticed something that made him pause. The woman was still there, but now she had several more boxes of documents around her, and she was no longer alone. 2 other people, a man in an expensive suit and a woman with short grey hair, had joined her. All 3 were speaking in hushed tones over what appeared to be financial statements and computer printouts. Marcus slowed down again, this time more deliberately. Through the glass he could see charts and graphs spread across the conference table, along with what looked like employee files and organizational charts. The grey-haired woman was pointing to something on one of the charts, while the quiet woman from that morning took notes. "What the hell is going on in there?" Marcus muttered to himself. His question was answered sooner than he expected. As he stood there trying to piece together what he was seeing, his phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant, Kelly. "Emergency department meeting called for 2 p.m. All marketing staff required to attend. No other details provided." Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Emergency meetings were never good news at Meridian. They usually meant budget cuts, layoffs, or some kind of corporate restructuring that would disrupt everyone's carefully laid plans. He looked back through the glass at the three people in conference room B. The quiet woman was now standing, reviewing what appeared to be a presentation of her own on a laptop screen. For the first time that day, Marcus really looked at her, not as background noise or temporary help, but as someone who might actually matter. That's when he noticed the briefcase beside her chair. It was made of expensive leather, the kind that senior executives carried. And next to it was a badge or ID card that he couldn't quite read from his angle, but it looked official, more official than anything a temporary worker or compliance assistant would carry. The pieces weren't fitting together the way Marcus had assumed they would. Who was this woman? Why had she been sitting alone all morning? And why was she now in what appeared to be a strategy session with two other serious-looking professionals? And what did any of it have to do with the emergency meeting that had just been called? Marcus's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Jennifer Walsh. "Marcus, have you heard anything about this afternoon meeting?" Jennifer's voice was tight with concern. "I tried calling David's office for details, but his assistant said she doesn't know anything beyond what was in the message." "I just got the same text," Marcus replied, still watching the scene in conference room B. "But Jennifer, I think we might have a problem. There's been someone here all morning, a woman I've never seen before, and she's been going through documents in conference room B. Now she's meeting with what looks like other executives and—" "Marcus, you're being paranoid again. It's probably just a routine audit or something. You know how corporate loves their surprise inspections." But even as Jennifer said the words, Marcus could hear the uncertainty in her voice. They both knew that routine audits didn't usually trigger emergency department meetings with just 4 hours' notice. As he ended the call, Marcus realized he was still standing in the hallway, staring through the glass like some kind of corporate stalker. The quiet woman looked up again, and this time her gaze was more pointed. She said something to her colleagues, and the man in the expensive suit turned to look at Marcus as well. Feeling suddenly exposed and foolish, Marcus quickly walked back to his office. But the feeling of unease that had started as a small knot in his stomach was now spreading through his chest like ice water. Something was very wrong. And somehow, the quiet woman he dismissed as irrelevant that morning was right in the center of it. He spent the next 2 hours trying to focus on work, but his concentration was shot. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward conference room B, watching as the mysterious meeting continued. More people came and went, some he recognized as senior managers from other departments, others he'd never seen before. At 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the emergency meeting, Marcus's phone rang. It was David Palmer, the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Marcus's direct supervisor. "Marcus, I need to see you in my office before the department meeting. Can you come up now?" David's tone was carefully neutral, but Marcus had worked for him long enough to recognize the undertone of serious concern. As he rode the elevator up to the 17th floor, Marcus tried to prepare himself for whatever was coming. David Palmer's office was a testament to corporate success. Panoramic city views, imported furniture, and enough awards and commendations to fill a small museum. But when Marcus walked in, David looked anything but successful. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, and there were stress lines around his eyes that Marcus had never noticed before. "Sit down, Marcus," David said without his usual pleasantries. "We need to talk." Marcus took a seat across from David's massive desk, noting that his boss was holding what appeared to be a formal letter on official letterhead. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Have you had any interactions today with a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez?" The name meant nothing to Marcus. "I don't think so. Should I know who that is?" David studied Marcus's face carefully. "She's the Inspector General for the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. She's been conducting an investigation into our marketing practices, and she's been observing our department since early this morning." The room seemed to spin around Marcus as the pieces finally clicked into place. The quiet woman in conference room B, the one he'd dismissed as irrelevant, the one he and Tom had mocked over coffee. She was a federal inspector. A federal inspector who had been watching and listening to everything that had happened in their department since 8 a.m. "Oh, God," Marcus whispered, his mouth suddenly dry. "David, I think I may have made a mistake." The color drained from Marcus's face as David Palmer's words sank in. "Inspector General, Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. Investigation." Each word hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly every interaction from that morning was replaying in his mind with horrifying clarity. "What kind of mistake?" David asked, his voice sharp with concern. Marcus felt sweat beginning to form at his temples. Tom and I, we saw her in the conference room this morning, and we didn't know who she was. We thought she was just some temp worker or compliance person doing paperwork. And? David's expression was growing darker by the second. We may have made some comments. Nothing serious, just we wondered what she was doing there, sitting alone with all those documents. I said something about her organizing filing systems while we were running million-dollar campaigns. David closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead with both hands. Marcus, please tell me you're not saying what I think you're saying. The full weight of the situation was crashing down on Marcus like an avalanche. Aileen Rodriguez, the quiet woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant, wasn't just any federal inspector. She was the Inspector General, which meant she was essentially the FBI of financial regulation. She had the power to shut down entire companies, file criminal charges, and destroy careers with a single report. How bad is it? Marcus asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. David picked up the official letter from his desk. She's been investigating irregularities in our client reporting procedures for the past 6 months. Apparently, someone filed a whistleblower complaint alleging that our marketing department has been misrepresenting financial data to potential clients. She's here to interview key personnel and review our practices. Marcus felt like he was going to be sick. Key personnel? You're on the list, Marcus. You're scheduled for a formal interview at 3:30, right after the department meeting. The implications were staggering. Dr. Rodriguez hadn't just been randomly assigned to their floor that morning. She had specifically chosen to position herself where she could observe the marketing department's daily operations. She'd been watching them, listening to them, taking notes on their behavior and attitudes. And Marcus had given her a front row seat to exactly the kind of arrogant, dismissive attitude that would make any investigator dig deeper.
David, what exactly are they investigating?
What irregularities? David hesitated, then seemed to decide that Marcus needed to know the full scope of what they were facing. The complaint alleges that we've been inflating projected returns for client investments, downplaying risks and potentially violating federal disclosure requirements. If they can prove it, we're looking at massive fines, criminal charges for executives, and possible closure of the entire marketing division. Marcus's hands were shaking now, but everyone in the industry pushes the boundaries on projections. That's just good salesmanship. That's exactly the kind of attitude that got us into this mess, David snapped. And if that's how you plan to approach your interview this afternoon, you might want to reconsider. The emergency department meeting at 2 p.m. was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced at Meridian. The usual energy and confidence that characterized their team was replaced by a tense, fearful silence. 23 marketing professionals sat around the large conference table, all of them now acutely aware that their every move had been under federal scrutiny. David Palmer stood at the head of the table, flanked by 2 executives from the legal department and Janet Morrison, the company's chief compliance officer. The mood was funeral serious. I'm sure you're all wondering why this meeting was called on such short notice, David began. The reason is that Meridian Financial Group is currently under investigation by the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. The investigation centers on our marketing practices and client communications. A murmur of shock and concern rippled through the room. Marcus noticed that several of his colleagues were looking around nervously, probably wondering who among them might be responsible for triggering the investigation. Janet Morrison stepped forward. The investigator in charge is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who some of you may have observed in Conference Room B this morning. Dr. Rodriguez is the Inspector General for the FFRC, and she has been granted full access to our facilities, personnel, and records. Marcus felt every eye in the room turn toward him, though he realized that was probably his paranoia talking. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone somehow knew about his morning comments. Over the next week, Janet continued, Dr. Rodriguez will be conducting individual interviews with members of this department. These interviews are not optional, and they will be recorded. You are strongly advised to be completely truthful and cooperative. Jennifer Walsh raised her hand. What specific allegations are we facing? Janet and David exchanged glances before David answered. The complaint alleges systematic misrepresentation of financial data in client materials, failure to adequately disclose investment risks, and potential fraudulent practices in our reporting procedures. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Marcus felt like he was watching his entire career implode in real time. These weren't minor compliance issues. These were the kinds of charges that ended careers and sometimes resulted in prison sentences. What does this mean for our jobs? Asked Tom Rodriguez. the same colleague who had been joking with Marcus about Dr. Rodriguez that morning. That depends entirely on what the investigation finds, David replied grimly. But I want to be clear about something. Anyone found to have engaged in fraudulent practices will be terminated immediately and may face criminal charges. Anyone found to have knowledge of such practices and failed to report them will also face serious consequences. Marcus's mind was racing. He'd been with Meridian for 6 years, and during that time, he'd certainly been aggressive in his sales presentations. He'd emphasized potential gains, minimized discussions of risks, and crafted marketing materials designed to generate enthusiasm rather than caution. Was that fraud? Was that what Dr. Rades did? Rodriguez was looking for? The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Janet Morrison outlining the company's cooperation with the investigation, and David Palmer stressing the importance of maintaining business operations during this difficult period. But Marcus barely heard any of it. All he could think about was his upcoming interview with the woman he'd spent the morning mocking. When the meeting finally ended, Marcus lingered in his office, trying to prepare for what was sure to be the most important conversation of his professional life. At 3:25 p.m., his phone rang. "Mr. Chen? This is Dr. Rodriguez. I'm ready for our interview now. Could you please come to conference room A on your floor?" Her voice was calm, professional, and completely neutral. There was no hint of anger or judgment, but somehow that made Marcus even more nervous. He'd been hoping for some indication of her mood, some clue about how to approach the conversation. Conference room A was just down the hall from where Dr. Rodriguez had spent the morning. As Marcus approached, he could see her through the glass walls, sitting at the far end of a long table with several folders open in front of her. She was no longer alone. A younger man in a dark suit sat beside her with a laptop, apparently serving as her assistant or recorder. Marcus knocked on the door and entered when she gestured for him to come in. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Up close, Dr. Aileen Rodriguez was even more unremarkable than she had appeared from a distance. Her grey-streaked hair was still pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same plain navy blazer from that morning. But her eyes, the same eyes that had observed him and Tom at the coffee machine, were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. "This is Agent Thompson from our investigative unit," she said, indicating the man beside her. "He'll be recording our conversation and taking notes. You have the right to have legal counsel present if you choose." Marcus's throat felt dry. "Do I need a lawyer? That's entirely up to you, Mr. Chen. This is an investigative interview, not a criminal proceeding. However, I do want to remind you that making false statements to federal investigators is a serious crime. The message was clear. Tell the truth or face the consequences." "I don't need a lawyer," Marcus said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. "I have nothing to hide." Dr. Rodriguez nodded and opened one of her folders. "Let's start with your role here at Meridian. How long have you been with the marketing department?" 6 years. I started as an associate and worked my way up to senior account manager. "And what exactly does your job entail?" Marcus launched into a description of his responsibilities: client presentations, campaign development, market analysis, and relationship management. Dr. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to show you some documents and get your perspective on them." She slid a folder across the table. "These are marketing materials that your department created for the Henderson Group. Are you familiar with these?" Marcus opened the folder and immediately recognized his own work. These were the presentation slides and brochures he'd developed for Henderson 6 months ago, the ones that had helped land their $12 million account. "Yes, I created these materials. Could you walk me through this section here?" Dr. Rodriguez pointed to a chart showing projected investment returns. "Specifically, how did you arrive at these figures?" Marcus studied the chart, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The projections were optimistic, very optimistic. He'd based them on best-case scenarios and had downplayed several risk factors that might affect returns. "These are based on historical market performance and our analysts' projections for the relevant sectors." "I see." "And this footnote here that mentions potential risks, was there additional risk disclosure provided to the client?" Marcus felt trapped. The footnote was tiny, deliberately designed to meet legal requirements without actually drawing attention to the risks. The footnote covers the standard disclosures. "Mr. Chen, I've reviewed the complete file for the Henderson Group presentation. There's no additional risk documentation beyond this footnote."
Would you say that adequately informed the client about the potential for significant losses?
The question hung in the air like a loaded gun.
Marcus realized that Dr. Rodriguez wasn't just asking about his marketing materials. She was asking him to admit that he'd misled clients about investment risks. We provide the disclosures required by law. But do you think those disclosures adequately prepared Henderson Group for the possibility that they could lose substantial portions of their investment? Marcus was starting to sweat again. He could see where this was going, and there was no good answer. If he said yes, he was admitting that the tiny footnote was sufficient warning for a $12 million investment. If he said no, he was admitting that his materials were potentially misleading. The projections were based on sound analysis, he said finally. Dr. Rodriguez made another note, then looked up at him with those sharp, observant eyes. Mr. Pierre Chen, I'm going to ask you about something else now. This morning, did you have any interactions with me before this interview? Marcus felt his heart stop. She knew. Of course she knew. I saw you in the conference room this morning. Did you make any comments about me to your colleagues? Marcus wanted to lie, wanted to pretend that nothing had happened, but Agent Thompson was recording everything, and Dr. Rodriguez clearly already knew the answer. I may have made some casual observations. What kind of observations? Marcus felt like he was drowning. I didn't know who you were. I thought you might be a temporary worker or someone from compliance. I made a comment about the paperwork you were working on. What specifically did you say, Mr. Chen? The question was asked in the same calm, professional tone she'd used throughout the interview, but Marcus could sense that this was the moment everything changed. This was when Dr. Rodriguez stopped being just an investigator and became someone who had been personally insulted by the person she was now interrogating. I said that you were going through papers like you were looking for buried treasure, and that we were running million-dollar campaigns while you were organizing filing systems. Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if Marcus had just confirmed something she'd already known. And what was your colleague Mr. Rodriguez's response to your observation? Marcus realized she'd been listening to their entire conversation. Every word, every joke, every dismissive comment had been heard by the one person who could destroy his career.
He laughed and said you probably got excited about tax codes and regulation updates. I see.
And did either of you consider that perhaps I was conducting official business that was directly related to your department's operations? The question was rhetorical, but Marcus felt compelled to answer anyway. No, we didn't, Dr. Rodriguez closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. Mr. Chen, in your 6 years at Meridian, have you ever considered that your attitudes toward compliance, regulation, and oversight might be part of the problem this company is facing? The interview continued for another 45 minutes, covering Marcus's specific marketing practices, his knowledge of company policies, and his understanding of federal regulations. But Marcus knew that the damage had been done in those first few questions. Rodriguez had painted a picture of someone who was not only potentially involved in fraudulent practices, but who had the arrogance to mock federal investigators while they were conducting their work. When the interview finally ended, Marcus felt like he'd just survived a car accident. He'd answered all the questions truthfully, but he knew that his honesty had probably sealed his fate. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Vary. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez said as she gathered her folders. If we need any additional information, we'll be in touch. As Marcus walked back to his office, he realized that his morning coffee conversation had probably cost him everything he'd worked for. The quiet woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant had turned out to be the most powerful person in the building that day, and his arrogant assumptions had just made him the poster child for everything wrong with Meridian's corporate culture. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a blur of anxiety and regret. Marcus sat in his office, staring at his computer screen but unable to focus on anything. Every few minutes he found himself replaying the interview with Dr. Rich Rodriguez, cringing at his own words and wondering how he could have been so monumentally stupid. By 6 p.m., most of the marketing department had cleared out, but Marcus remained at his desk, partly because he was afraid to leave, and partly because he had nowhere else he wanted to be. His condo, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture, suddenly seemed like a monument to arrogance rather than success. His phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend, Sarah. How was your day? Still coming to dinner with my parents tomorrow? Marcus stared at the message, realizing he'd completely forgotten about the dinner. Sarah had been planning it for weeks. A chance for him to meet her parents, and for her to show off her successful boyfriend. The irony was almost unbearable. Something came up at work, he texted back. Might need to postpone. His phone rang immediately. Marcus, what do you mean? Something came up. You promised you'd be there. Sarah, I can't explain it right now, but there's a situation at work. A serious situation. Are you in trouble? The simple question hung in the air. Was he in trouble? He'd spent years building his career, his reputation, his entire identity around being successful at Meridian Financial Group, and now, because of a few careless comments and an attitude he'd never even thought to examine, all of it was in jeopardy. I don't know yet, he said finally, but it's possible. After Sarah hung up, clearly frustrated and confused, Marcus finally decided to go home. As he gathered his belongings, he noticed that the lights were still on in conference room B. Dr. Rodriguez was still there, now working with what appeared to be an even larger team of investigators. They had charts and graphs spread across multiple tables, and several laptops were running what looked like complex data analysis programs. For the first time that day, Marcus really looked at what they were doing, and what he saw made his stomach clench with fear. These weren't people conducting a routine compliance check. This was a major federal investigation with serious resources behind it. Dr. Rodriguez had the backing of the entire Federal Financial Regulatory Commission, and from the scope of materials spread around that conference room, it was clear they'd been investigating Meridian for months, possibly years. The drive home through downtown traffic gave Marcus time to think, and the more he thought, the worse he felt. He'd always prided himself on being smart, observant, and politically savvy. How had he missed something so obvious? How had he made such a catastrophic error in judgment? The answer, he was beginning to realize, was that he'd become exactly the kind of person he'd once promised himself he'd never become. Somewhere between the Queen's accounting firm and the downtown corner office, Marcus had developed a blind spot the size of a skyscraper. He'd started categorizing people as either useful to his career or beneath his notice, and that mindset had just destroyed everything he'd worked for. That night, Marcus barely slept. He kept replaying every interaction he'd had with Dr. Baggett. Rodriguez, every word of their interview, every moment when he could have handled things differently. By morning, he'd convinced himself that maybe the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe Dr. Rodriguez was professional enough to separate his morning comments from her investigation. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage his career. He was wrong. Wednesday morning brought an email that shattered any remaining optimism. Mr. Chen, please report to HR at 9 a.m. for a meeting with Janet Morrison and David Palmer. Bring your company laptop, access cards, and any company materials in your possession. Marcus stared at the message, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The language was formal and ominous. This wasn't a follow-up meeting about the investigation. This was the beginning of the end. The HR meeting was everything Marcus had feared it would be. Janet Morrison sat across from him with a file folder thick enough to suggest they'd been building a case for some time. David Palmer looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. Marcus, Janet began. As you know, the company is cooperating fully with the federal investigation into our marketing practices. As part of that cooperation, we've been required to review the conduct of all personnel who had access to the materials in question. Marcus nodded, though his mouth felt too dry to speak. Yesterday's interview with Dr. Rodriguez raised some concerns about your professional judgment and your attitude toward regulatory oversight. Additionally, our internal review of your marketing materials has identified several instances of potentially problematic disclosure practices. David Palmer leaned forward. Marcus, I want you to know that this isn't just about yesterday. The investigators provided us with a detailed timeline of your interactions with Dr. Rodriguez, but they also had recordings of conversations throughout the morning. The room seemed to spin around Marcus. Recordings? Dr. Rodriguez was wearing a recording device during her observation period, Janet explained. Your comments about her were captured, along with several other conversations that demonstrated a pattern of dismissive attitudes toward compliance and regulation. Marcus felt like he was falling through the floor. Not only had Dr. Rodriguez heard his mocking comments, but she had them on tape. Permanent, undeniable evidence of his arrogance and poor judgment. What does this mean for my employment? Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. Janet Morrison opened the file folder and removed a formal document. Effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the federal investigation. Your access to company systems has been revoked, and you're prohibited from contacting clients or discussing the investigation with current employees. And after the investigation, David Palmer answered this time. Marcus, I'm going to be honest with you. The evidence against the marketing department is substantial. Dr. Rodriguez has documentation going back 3 years showing systematic disclosure violations. Combined with your recorded comments about federal investigators, it's unlikely that Meridian will be able to retain you regardless of the investigation's outcome. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation became clear. He wasn't just facing suspension, he was looking at the complete destruction of his career. In the span of 24 hours, he'd gone from a rising star to a liability that the company needed to eliminate. As he cleaned out his office under the watchful eye of a security guard, Marcus caught a glimpse of Dr. Rodriguez in Conference Room B. She was meeting with what appeared to be senior executives from multiple departments, and the scope of materials on the tables had grown even larger. The investigation that had started with his department was clearly expanding throughout the company. Jennifer Walsh appeared beside him as he packed his personal items into a cardboard box. "Marcus, I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I heard about the administrative leave." "It's over, Jennifer. My career is over." "You don't know that. Maybe when this investigation is finished, things will settle down." Marcus shook his head. "You don't understand. I didn't just get caught up in the investigation, I made it personal. I mocked the investigator to her face. And she has it all on tape." Jennifer's expression shifted from sympathy to shock. "You what?" "Yesterday morning, when she was sitting in the conference room, Tom and I saw her and assumed she was some temp worker or compliance person. We made jokes about her going through paperwork while we were running million-dollar campaigns. Turns out she was recording everything." "Oh my God, Marcus!" "The worst part is, she gave me every opportunity to be professional during the interview. She didn't act angry or vindictive. She just asked questions and let me hang myself with my own words." As Marcus carried his box of belongings toward the elevator, he passed Conference Room B one more time. "Doctor," Rodriguez looked up from her meeting and caught his eye through the glass. For a moment they stared at each other, the federal investigator and the disgraced marketing executive. What Marcus saw in her expression surprised him. There was no triumph, no satisfaction at having brought down an arrogant corporate climber. Instead, there was something that looked almost like sadness, as if she took no pleasure in the destruction of careers, even when those careers had been built on questionable practices. The elevator ride down to the lobby gave Marcus a few minutes to process what had just happened. 6 years of work, 6 years of climbing the corporate ladder, 6 years of building what he thought was an unshakable reputation, all of it destroyed by a few minutes of casual arrogance. But as devastating as the immediate consequences were, Marcus was beginning to realize that the real damage went deeper than just his job. Dr. Rodriguez's investigation had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about who he'd become and how he'd been doing business. The marketing materials she'd shown him during the interview weren't anomalies or honest mistakes. They were part of a pattern of behavior that prioritized profits over honesty, salesmanship over integrity. He'd been so focused on landing big accounts and impressing clients that he'd lost sight of the fact that his success was built on misleading people about financial risks. Over the next few days, as Marcus sat in his condo watching news reports about the expanding investigation at Meridian, the full scope of Dr. Rodriguez's work became clear. She wasn't just investigating his department. She was uncovering a web of fraudulent practices that reached into the highest levels of the company. The quiet woman he dismissed as irrelevant was actually one of the most respected investigators in federal financial regulation. Dr. Border, Elena Rodriguez had a PhD in forensic accounting from MIT, 15 years of experience with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and a reputation for taking down white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. Her investigation into Meridian would eventually result in criminal charges against 12 executives, fines totaling over $200 million, and the complete restructuring of the company's marketing and compliance departments. The Henderson Group account that Marcus had been so proud of landing, it turned out to be based on projections that violated multiple federal disclosure requirements. But perhaps most importantly for Marcus, Dr. Rodriguez's investigation had revealed something that he was only now beginning to understand. The quiet woman organizing paperwork in Conference Room B had been doing work that was infinitely more important and valuable than anything happening in Meridian's marketing department. While Marcus had been crafting presentations designed to generate enthusiasm and close deals, Dr. Pitt Shea Rodriguez had been protecting investors from fraud. While he'd been focused on his commission checks and his next promotion, she'd been ensuring that companies like Meridian couldn't steal people's life savings through misleading marketing materials. The irony was crushing. Marcus had spent years believing that his work was important, that his success meant something. that he was making a valuable contribution to the business world. But Dr. Rodriguez's investigation had shown him that his version of success was actually part of a system designed to take advantage of people who trusted financial professionals to tell them the truth. As Marcus sat in his living room, surrounded by the expensive toys and status symbols he'd accumulated during his rise through the corporate ranks, he realized that every single item had been purchased with money earned by misleading clients about investment risks. His BMW, his designer clothes, his corner office with its city views, all of it had been financed by a career built on practices that Dr. Rodriguez was now exposing as fraudulent. The quiet woman he'd mocked for organizing paperwork had been doing more valuable work in one morning than Marcus had accomplished in 6 years. And now, thanks to his own arrogance and blindness, his career was over. His reputation was destroyed, and his future was completely uncertain. But, as painful as this realization was, Marcus was starting to understand that maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it was time to figure out who he really wanted to be, and what kind of work actually mattered. 2 weeks after his forced departure from Meridian, Marcus Chen found himself in an unfamiliar position, unemployed, unemployable, and completely alone with his thoughts. The news of the federal investigation had spread quickly through the financial industry, and his name was now associated with one of the biggest corporate fraud scandals of the year. His attempts to find new employment had been met with polite rejections and uncomfortable silences. Word traveled fast in their industry, and no reputable firm wanted to hire someone who had been investigated by the Inspector General's office. The few interviews he'd managed to secure ended abruptly when potential employers learned about his role in the Meridian investigation. Sarah had ended their relationship after a difficult conversation about his future prospects. "I don't understand how you could have been so careless," she'd said. "One conversation destroyed everything we were building together." But as Marcus reflected on her words, he began to realize that his problems went much deeper than one careless conversation. Dr. Rodriguez's investigation had simply exposed attitudes and practices that had been developing for years. He spent his days reading news coverage of the Meridian investigation, learning details about Dr. Rodriguez's work that made him feel even worse about his initial impressions of her. The woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant was actually a legend in financial regulatory circles. Elena Rodriguez had started her career as a forensic accountant after watching her immigrant parents lose their life savings to a fraudulent investment scheme. She'd earned her doctorate while working full-time at the SEC, and had spent her career taking down exactly the kind of sophisticated financial fraud that Meridian had been perpetrating. Her investigation into Meridian wasn't her first major case. She'd previously exposed corruption at 3 other major financial firms, resulting in over $1 billion in fines and the imprisonment of dozens of executives. The financial press called her the most feared investigator on Wall Street, and industry insiders referred to her as the woman who never stops digging. Reading about her background made Marcus feel even more ashamed of his morning comments. Dr. Rodriguez hadn't been organizing filing systems. She'd been meticulously documenting evidence of fraud that had been harming investors for years. While he'd been joking about her apparent irrelevance, she'd been building a case that would ultimately protect thousands of people from financial ruin. 3 weeks into his unemployment, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Tom Rodriguez, his former colleague who had laughed along with his jokes about Dr. Rodriguez that morning. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this," Tom said, his voice tight with stress. "They just served me with a subpoena. I have to testify before a federal grand jury next month." Marcus felt his stomach drop. About what? About the morning conversations. About our attitudes toward compliance. About the culture in our department. Dr. Rodriguez's recordings are being used as evidence in the criminal case against David Palmer and the other executives. The implications were staggering. Marcus realized that his recorded comments weren't just going to cost him his job, they were going to be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. His mocking words about the quiet woman organizing paperwork would be played for a federal grand jury as an example of the corporate culture that had enabled fraud at Meridian. "Tom, what did our lawyers tell you?" "They said to tell the truth and hope that cooperating with the investigation keeps me out of prison." "Marcus, they're not just going after the executives. They're building cases against everyone who knew about the fraudulent practices and failed to report them." After Tom hung up, Marcus sat in his empty condo, fully grasping the scope of what Dr. Rodriguez had uncovered. This wasn't just about misleading marketing materials or inadequate risk disclosures. The investigation had revealed a systematic pattern of fraud that had been designed to steal money from investors while enriching company executives and sales staff. The Henderson Group account that Marcus had been so proud of? The clients had lost 60% of their investment when the market turned, exactly as the undisclosed risk factors had predicted. But because of Marcus's optimistic projections and minimal risk warnings, Henderson Group had invested far more than they could afford to lose. Rodriguez's investigation had documented how Meridian's marketing department had deliberately obscured risk factors while inflating potential returns, resulting in client losses of over $400 million. The quiet woman Marcus had mocked had been working to expose a scheme that had destroyed the retirement savings of thousands of investors. A month after his departure from Meridian, Marcus received a letter that he'd been dreading, a subpoena requiring his testimony before the federal grand jury investigating the case. The letter was signed by Dr. Elena Rodriguez in her capacity as lead investigator. As he stared at the official document, Marcus realized that he would have to face her again, this time in a federal courtroom, under oath, with his recorded comments being used as evidence of the corporate culture that had enabled fraud. The grand jury testimony was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the day Marcus had first seen Dr. Rodriguez sitting quietly in Conference Room B. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on him. On the morning of his testimony, Marcus arrived at the federal courthouse downtown, an imposing granite building that seemed designed to remind people of the weight of federal justice. As he waited in the witness room, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that Tuesday morning at Meridian. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a successful marketing executive with a bright future and an unshakable confidence in his own judgment. Now he was unemployed, under federal investigation, and about to testify in a criminal case that could send his former colleagues to prison. When he was called into the grand jury room, Marcus found himself facing 23 citizens who would decide whether there was enough evidence to bring criminal charges against Meridian's executives. Dr. Rodriguez sat at a table in front of the jury, surrounded by files and documents that represented months of investigation. "Mr. Chen," she began, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism he remembered from their interview, "thank you for appearing today. I'd like to start by asking about your role in the marketing materials that were provided to the Henderson Group." For the next 2 hours, Miss Hare. Rodriguez walked Marcus through his work at Meridian with methodical precision. She had documentation of every misleading projection he'd created, every risk factor he'd minimized, every client presentation that had prioritized salesmanship over honesty. But what made the testimony truly devastating was when she played the recording from that Tuesday morning. Marcus's voice filled the courtroom as he mocked the quiet woman organizing paperwork while they were running million-dollar campaigns. "Mr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez said after the recording finished, "At the time you made those comments, I was documenting evidence that your department's marketing materials had violated federal disclosure requirements in ways that cost investors over $400 million. Do you still believe that organizing paperwork is less important than running million-dollar campaigns?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus realized that Dr. Rodriguez wasn't just asking him to acknowledge his factual error. She was asking him to confront the fundamental arrogance that had made such an error possible. "No," he said quietly. "I understand now that I was completely wrong. What do you understand now that you didn't understand then?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would become part of the official record of the federal investigation. "I understand that while I was focused on generating sales and earning commissions, you were protecting investors from exactly the kind of fraudulent practices that my department was engaged in. I understand that the work you were doing was infinitely more important than anything I was accomplishing." Dr. Rodriguez nodded and made a note. "Mr. Chen, looking back at your 6 years at Meridian, do you believe that you knowingly participated in fraudulent activities?" The question was the one Marcus had been dreading, but also the one he'd been preparing for since his departure from Meridian. His lawyers had advised him to minimize his culpability, to claim ignorance of the broader fraud, to present himself as a victim of corporate culture rather than a participant in criminal activity. But as Marcus looked around the grand jury room, at the ordinary citizens who had been called to serve justice, at Dr. Rodriguez with her neat stacks of evidence, at the court reporter carefully recording every word, he realized that the time for self-serving lies was over. "Yes," he said, "I knowingly created marketing materials that misrepresented investment risks to clients. I prioritized sales goals over honest disclosure. I participated in a culture that treated regulatory compliance as an obstacle to profit rather than a protection for investors." Doctor, Rodriguez's expression showed neither satisfaction nor surprise at his admission. She simply nodded and moved on to her next question. In your opinion, was this fraudulent activity systemic within Meridian's marketing department?
Yes.
It was systemic, it was encouraged by management, and it was rewarded with promotions and bonuses. Anyone who raised concerns about compliance or disclosure was marginalized or transferred to less profitable accounts. The testimony continued for another hour, with Dr. Dio Trey. Rodriguez methodically building a case that the fraud at Meridian had been widespread, intentional, and profitable for the employees who participated in it. Marcus found himself providing details that would likely be used to prosecute his former colleagues and supervisors. When the testimony finally ended, Dr. Rodriguez thanked him for his cooperation and reminded him that he might be called to testify again if the case went to trial. As Marcus left the courthouse, he realized that his testimony had probably sealed the fate of David Palmer and the other Meridian executives. But more importantly, it had forced him to confront the reality of what he'd been doing for the past 6 years. The quiet woman he'd mocked for organizing paperwork had just spent 2 hours demonstrating that her work was protecting people from exactly the kind of harm that his work had been causing. Dr. Rodriguez's investigation wasn't just about enforcing regulations or collecting fines. It was about ensuring that companies couldn't steal people's money through sophisticated marketing schemes. Over the following weeks, as news of the grand jury proceedings leaked to the press, Marcus watched his former life disintegrate completely. David Palmer and 2 other executives were indicted on federal fraud charges. The marketing department was disbanded, and Meridian agreed to pay over $200 million in fines and restitution to defrauded investors. Marcus's own legal situation remained uncertain. While he had cooperated with the investigation, his recorded comments and admitted participation in fraudulent practices left him vulnerable to criminal charges. His lawyers were negotiating with federal prosecutors, hoping that his testimony would result in immunity or reduced charges. But as Marcus waited to learn his fate, he began to understand that his legal problems were the least of his concerns. The real question wasn't whether he would go to prison, it was whether he could figure out how to rebuild his life around something more meaningful than the pursuit of status and money. The quiet woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant had shown him that there were people in the world doing work that actually mattered. While he'd been crafting misleading presentations to generate commissions, Dr. Rodriguez had been protecting investors from fraud. While he'd been focused on his next promotion, she'd been ensuring that companies couldn't steal people's life savings. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus began to wonder what it would be like to do work that helped people instead of exploiting them. What it would be like to be someone whose presence in a conference room made the world a little bit safer, rather than a little bit more dangerous. The quiet woman had taught him that the most powerful people aren't always the ones making the most noise. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting quietly in corner offices, methodically documenting evidence, patiently building cases, and ensuring that justice eventually finds its way to those who think they're untouchable. Marcus realized that he had a choice to make. He could spend the rest of his life regretting his mistakes, or he could try to become the kind of person he should have been all along. Someone like Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who used their skills and knowledge to protect people rather than to exploit them. 6 months after his grand jury testimony, Marcus Chen stood in line at a community college registration office, holding course catalogs for forensic accounting and financial ethics programs. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same skills he'd used to mislead investors could potentially be redirected toward protecting them. His legal situation had finally been resolved through a plea agreement that required him to pay substantial fines, perform community service, and accept a permanent ban from working in investment advisory roles. He'd avoided prison, but his career in high-stakes finance was over forever. The community service portion of his sentence had been enlightening in ways he'd never expected. He'd been assigned to help elderly victims of financial fraud navigate the complex process of recovering their stolen money. Week after week, he sat across from people who had lost their life savings to schemes remarkably similar to the ones he'd helped create at Meridian. There was Eleanor Martinez, a 78-year-old widow who had invested her late husband's pension with a company that promised guaranteed returns of 15% annually. The marketing materials she showed Marcus were almost identical to presentations he'd created. Optimistic projections, minimal risk disclosures, and language designed to generate excitement rather than caution.
They made it sound so safe, Mrs. Martinez had told him during one of their sessions.
The young man who sold it to me was so confident, so well-dressed. He seemed to know what he was talking about. Marcus had helped Mrs. Beezy's Jewish. Martinez filed claims with various regulatory agencies, knowing that she would likely recover only a fraction of her losses. As he worked on her case, he couldn't help but think about the Henderson Group and all the other clients whose lives he'd disrupted through his own confident presentations and well-tailored suits. The forensic accounting classes were teaching Marcus to see financial fraud from the investigator's perspective. He learned about the techniques Dr. Opeb, Rodriguez, and others used to uncover sophisticated schemes, the meticulous documentation required to build federal cases, and the patience needed to pursue justice through complex legal proceedings. His professor, Dr. Janet Williams, was a former FBI financial crimes investigator who had worked several cases with Dr. Rodriguez over the years. When Marcus mentioned his connection to the Meridian investigation, Dr. Williams had been surprisingly supportive. Elena Rodriguez is one of the most ethical people I've ever known, Dr. Williams had told him after class one day. She doesn't take satisfaction in destroying careers, even when those careers probably deserve to be destroyed. She's told me before that she hopes the people she investigates will use the experience to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem. The comment had stayed with Marcus and eventually led him to do something he'd been considering for months. He wrote a letter to Dr. Rodriguez. The letter was difficult to write. How do you apologize to someone whose life's work you'd mocked? How do you express regret for attitudes that had enabled harm to thousands of people? Marcus went through dozens of drafts before settling on something simple and honest. Dr. Rodriguez, I know you probably don't remember me, but I'm Marcus Chen, the former Meridian marketing manager who made inappropriate comments about your work during your investigation. I wanted you to know that I've spent the past 6 months trying to understand how wrong I was about everything. I'm now studying forensic accounting and working with fraud victims through my community service. Every day, I meet people who are harmed by the kind of marketing practices I used to create. I'm beginning to understand that the work you were doing that Tuesday morning was protecting people from exactly the kind of harm I was causing. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not looking for absolution. I just wanted you to know that your investigation changed more than my career. It changed how I see the world and what I want to contribute to it. If there's ever any way I can use my experience to help prevent the kind of fraud I used to participate in, I hope you'll consider me. I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm willing to spend the rest of my career earning the right to be part of the solution. Respectfully, Marcus Chen. Marcus hadn't expected a response, so he was shocked when he received a phone call 3 weeks later. Mr. Chen, this is Dr. Chen, Elena Rodriguez. I received your letter, and I wondered if you might be interested in meeting for coffee. I have a proposition that might interest you. They met at a small cafe near the community college where Marcus was taking his classes. Dr. Rodriguez looked exactly as he remembered. Unremarkable in appearance, but with those same sharp, observant eyes that seemed to see everything. Mr. Chen, I want to start by saying that I appreciate your letter. It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes that publicly, especially when you're under no legal obligation to do so. Marcus felt a mix of shame and relief. Dr. Ralph Rodriguez, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I wrote in that letter. My comments that morning were inexcusable. They were certainly unprofessional, she agreed. But they were also revealing. They showed me exactly the kind of attitude that makes financial fraud possible. Arrogance, dismissiveness toward oversight, and the assumption that compliance work is somehow less important than sales work. Marcus nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. The reason I wanted to meet with you, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is that I think your experience could be valuable in a way you might not have considered. She opened a folder and removed several documents. I'm working on a new initiative to help financial companies identify and eliminate the cultural attitudes that lead to fraud. We're looking for people who understand those attitudes from the inside, people who can help us teach compliance from the perspective of someone who used to circumvent it. Marcus stared at the documents, hardly believing what he was hearing. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity to earn a job. It would require you to complete your forensic accounting certification, undergo extensive additional training, and accept ongoing supervision for at least 2 years. You'd be working under my direct oversight, helping to develop training programs for financial companies. The offer was stunning, but Marcus had learned enough about Dr. Rodriguez to know that she didn't make decisions lightly. Why would you take a chance on someone like me? Because someone like you is exactly who we need, she replied. You understand how smart, educated people convince themselves that harmful practices are acceptable. You know how marketing departments justify misleading clients. You've lived inside the culture that creates fraud, and that perspective could be invaluable in preventing it. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the position would involve developing case studies based on real fraud investigations, creating training materials that helped financial professionals recognize ethical blind spots, and eventually testifying as an expert witness in cases involving corporate culture and marketing fraud. It wouldn't be easy work, she warned. You'd be constantly confronting the worst aspects of your own past behavior. You'd be working with fraud victims, reviewing cases where people lost their life savings, and helping prosecute people who used to be your peers. Marcus thought about Mrs. Martinez and the other fraud victims he'd been working with through his community service. He thought about the Henderson Group clients who had lost 60% of their investments based on his misleading presentations. He thought about the thousands of investors who had been harmed by the culture he'd helped create at Meridian. Dr. Rodriguez, I know I don't deserve this opportunity, but if you're willing to give it to me, I promise I'll spend every day trying to earn it. She nodded and closed the folder. Mr. Chen, redemption isn't something that's given to you. It's something you earn through years of consistent choices. If you decide to take this path, you'll be choosing to spend the rest of your career undoing the kind of damage you used to cause. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into the forensic accounting program with an intensity that surprised his classmates and professors. He studied fraud detection techniques with the fervor of someone who had once been on the other side of those investigations. He learnt about regulatory frameworks with the dedication of someone who understood the consequences of circumventing them. The training program with Dr. Rodriguez's team was even more challenging. He had to review his own work from Meridian, analyzing his marketing materials with the same critical perspective that had once been used to prosecute him. He had to identify the specific techniques he'd used to mislead clients, and develop training materials that would teach other financial professionals to recognize and avoid those same mistakes. The most difficult part was working directly with fraud victims. Rodriguez required him to spend time with people who had been harmed by marketing practices identical to his own, listening to their stories and understanding the human cost of financial fraud. You need to see the faces behind the statistics, she explained during one of their weekly supervision meetings. It's easy to rationalize misleading marketing practices when you think of clients as account numbers or commission opportunities. It's much harder when you understand that every fraudulent transaction represents someone's destroyed retirement, someone's lost home, someone's children who can't afford college. After 18 months of training and supervised work, Marcus was finally allowed to begin developing his own training programs. His first project was creating a workshop for marketing departments at financial firms designed to help sales professionals recognize when their practices cross the line from aggressive selling to fraud. The workshop was based on his own experience at Meridian, walking participants through the gradual process by which ethical boundaries get eroded. He showed them actual examples of his own marketing materials, explaining how small compromises on disclosure and risk assessment had eventually led to systematic fraud. The thing about financial fraud, Marcus would tell workshop participants, is that it rarely starts with someone deciding to steal money. It usually starts with someone deciding that the rules don't apply to them, that their situation is special, that a small compromise on ethics is justified by business necessity. He would then play the recording of his comments about Dr. Rodriguez from that Tuesday morning at Meridian, using his own words as an example of the arrogance that makes fraud possible. I thought I was the important person in that scenario, he would explain. I thought my million-dollar campaigns mattered more than her paperwork. But while I was creating marketing materials that would ultimately cost investors $400 million, she was building a case to protect them from exactly the kind of harm I was causing. The workshops were surprisingly effective. Participants responded to Marcus's authenticity and his willingness to use his own failures as teaching tools. Financial companies began requesting his training programs, and Dr. Rodriguez started assigning him to more complex cases. 2 years after that first coffee meeting, Dr. Rodriguez called Marcus into her office for his final supervision review. Mr. Chen, when I first met you, you represented everything that was wrong with financial industry culture. You were arrogant, dismissive of oversight, and completely blind to the harm your work was causing. Marcus nodded, remembering that Tuesday morning and the person he'd been then. But over the past 2 years, you've become one of our most effective fraud prevention specialists. You understand industry practices from the inside, you communicate ethical principles in ways that resonate with sales professionals, and you've helped us develop training programs that are actually changing corporate cultures. She handed him an official letter. I'm recommending you for permanent certification as a fraud prevention consultant. You'll be working independently now, though you'll always have my support when you need it. Marcus read the letter, hardly believing how much his life had changed since that morning when he'd mocked the quiet woman organizing paperwork. Dr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that you gave me something I didn't deserve and probably couldn't have earned anywhere else. You gave me a chance to become someone I could actually respect."
She smiled, the first time Marcus had ever seen her smile. "Mr. Chen, you've earned this opportunity through 2 years of hard work and honest self-examination.
But more importantly, you've learned to use your skills to protect people instead of exploiting them." As Marcus left Dr. God,
Rodriguez's office that day, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. The arrogant marketing executive who had dismissed federal investigators as irrelevant was gone, replaced by someone who spent his days teaching other people to recognize and avoid the mistakes that had once defined his career. He thought about the hundreds of financial professionals who had attended his workshops, many of whom had told him that his presentation had changed how they approached their work.
he thought about the fraud cases he'd helped investigate, the victims he'd assisted, and the corrupt practices he'd helped expose. Most importantly, he thought about Dr. Kostav, Elena Rodriguez, the quiet woman whose methodical paperwork had changed his life completely. She'd shown him that the most important work often happens behind the scenes, done by people who don't need recognition or applause to know that what they're doing matters.
The Tuesday morning when Marcus had first seen her in Conference Room B seemed like a lifetime ago. The person he'd been then, focused on status, money, and his own advancement, felt like a stranger.
The person he was now understood that true success wasn't measured by commission checks or corner offices, but by whether your work made the world a little bit safer for the people who needed protection the most.
The quiet woman had taught him that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit in a conference room, organize paperwork, and patiently build cases that will protect people from those who want to take advantage of them. And Marcus had learned that the most meaningful career he could have was helping to ensure that the next generation of financial professionals would never make the mistakes that had once destroyed his own life and harmed so many others. In the end, Dr. Rodriguez's investigation had done more than expose fraud at Meridian Financial Group. It had shown Marcus who he really wanted to be and given him the chance to spend the rest of his career earning the right to be that person.